Olá, boa tarde a todos. Sejam bem-vindos. Mais um Tiaços. Novamente, mais uma vez. Às vezes eu fico pensando, eu não sei, Luciana Ximenes, nem Isa Carvalho, como é que a gente conseguiu chegar aqui. Hoje, com a grande alegria, satisfação e uma imensa honra em receber Shinoda Bolen conosco aqui no nosso projeto. Seja muito bem-vinda, Jean. Um prazer te receber. Gostei da nossa conversa prévia, muito simpática, muito agradável. Eu vou fazer a apresentação formal. Depois a gente continua. O currículo da Jean é um currículo largo. Eu vou tentar aqui fazer uma espécie de resumo, mas vamos lá. Jean Shinoda Bolen é psiquiatra, analista junguiana, palestrante internacionalmente conhecida e autora de 13 livros influentes em mais de 100 edições estrangeiras. Não vou citar todos, vou citar alguns: O Tal da Psicologia, Deusas em Toda Mulher, O Anel do Poder, Deusas em Mulheres Mais Velhas, O Espírito Indomável em Todas as Mulheres, e uma série de tantos outros. A Jean é Distinguished Life Fellow da Sociedade Americana de Psiquiatria, ex-professora de Psiquiatria Clínica da Universidade da Califórnia, em São Francisco, e ex-membro do Conselho da Foundation for Women, da Associação de Psicologia Transpessoal e do Instituto C.G. Jung de São Francisco. Ela também foi vencedora do prêmio Lifetime em 2020 e 2021 do Marquis Who is Who. Ela atende em Mill Valley, na Califórnia. A Jean também tem atuado no milionésimo Círculo, que foi inspirada num livro seu. Os seus membros convocadores têm atuado nas Nações Unidas e no Parlamento das Religiões do Mundo. A Jean é representante da ONG Mulheres do Mundo, da Summit Foundation, na ONU, tendo representado também Pathway to Peace. Ela é uma das principais defensoras da 5ª Conferência Mundial sobre Mulheres na Índia, que ocorrerá esse ano, em 2022. Ela recebeu o prêmio Pioneiros em Arte, Ciência e Alma da Cura, do Instituto for Health and Healing, é diplomata do Conselho Americano de Psicologia e Neurologia e participou de 3 documentários aclamados: o filme Antiproliferação Nuclear, vencedor do Oscar, Mulheres pela América, pelo Mundo, e das produções do Conselho de Cinema Canadense Deusa Lembrada e Femme, Mulheres Curando o Mundo. Jean, teu currículo é, enfim, largo, vasto, como a sua história. Para nós, imenso prazer te receber. Eu acho que não é a primeira vez que você fala para um público brasileiro, né? Mas você falou que já tem bastante tempo. Então, da nossa parte, sinta-se bem-vinda. Repito, é uma grande alegria e um grande orgulho para nós ter você conosco. A casa é sua. Fica à vontade.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. It's also a whole new experience to be sitting in my home and talking to people that are on another continent, where your weather is mild and pleasant because you're in a different season than we are. And here we are in California and in the United States, where the temperatures are going way, way up, and there are fires in many parts of the country. And it's true of Western Europe as well, and England. So you who are in the Southern Hemisphere, enjoy what you are doing and where you are right now. because the weather is a problem. Until all of us become activists within our own governments to help stop the global warming, things will keep on getting hotter and life is going to be more difficult unless we respond to our own sense of here we are at a time of historical shift. And here we are, women who have been educated along the way. And here you are with time to listen to something like this. Surely you are waiting to get some kind of internal sense of what you want to do with your life. I'm thinking about the poet Mary Oliver, who asks, tell me, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And that particular line does need translating, because wild doesn't mean wild as in the way it's normally used, but wild is what is in you from the moment you came into this world, because we have patterns of talents and archetypes, and we grow up in a culture that either suppresses parts of us as women, as girls, and this happens to the men and boys as well. In a stereotypical world, which patriarchy is, then whole people don't happen. Women are supposed to stay in their place, men are supposed to stay in their place, and it's often worked on in boys much earlier than it does in girls. So I think when you see men who are leading the world and you realize that as boys, they may have been either bullies, or if they had been sentimental feeling type kids, they were made fun of and they had to suppress it. So it is really women who increasingly from the 1970s on became more and more educated. And now in many countries, including mine, we suddenly have a number of women governors. We've got, someday we'll probably have a woman president. We have a woman vice president now. So that there is an evolution of men and women working together in lots of places in the world, and lots of individual relationships, whatever relationships you're in. Many of you probably have engaged in a relationship where you have tilted it in the direction, or you wanted to, where you are partners that respect one another, and it's natural for one person to be more talented in certain ways than the other. So when Mary Oliver talks about, tell me, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Precious is obvious, but wild is what you came into the world with. Wild was maybe based on previous lives, we don't know. But what we do know is that there are archetypal qualities that come in with the child, and talents, you know, a natural talent for language, for music, for art. That's built in to the little baby who comes into the world. Well, so are all those other qualities that had to do with gender that then might have been considered precious, or might have been considered not in this family. Girls don't behave like that. Boys don't behave like that. And so you learn to suppress things. Now, all of you are Jungian in some fashion or another. And you know, one of the things about being Jungian is you probably have had all along a side of yourself that has been observant and introverted and not immediately reactive. And maybe you also have had and paid attention to dreams. And maybe you, along the way, realize that as a more introverted person, you don't automatically just sort of join in right away. From the first time you start going to school at 5 or 6, an introverted child is often pushed to be extroverted, but the natural thing a child does is watch what the game is to decide what are the rules of the game, and then do I want to play? While the extroverted kid is pushed in or naturally goes in and in play decides whether they like to play this or not. Well, that is just a true sign of what we did when we were first introduced to group processes at 5 or 6. But it is actually very similar to whatever it is that affected you as you went from probably into high school, certainly into college. And most of you probably are college graduates, because there's a certain level of education that I've always noticed in people that come into Jungian meetings and things, because there's a natural kind of background of information from the education you got along the way, and the curiosity, intellectual curiosity, psychological curiosity, that has brought you to this sort of a little bit of a outlier group. You're not one of the crowd. If you have chosen your own path, or been, for example, acceptable but different than some of the people in your own family. Most people who come to individuate, meaning to become the person they could be, do so because they've had some problems trying to conform and adapt to who others expected them to be. And that some way along the line, the depression, the anxiety, the sense of I'm not fitting in, takes them into psychotherapy and often draws them into more Jungian kinds of ways of looking at themselves. So I think we start with that. We start with wondering more about ourselves. Who are we? What is the psychological typology? What matters to us? What are our talents? And add to that something that I can really appreciate from my own history, is in that depending on where and when you are a child and what was going on in your family and in your country and in the world as you grew up, all of those elements will have affected you, affected your parents, affected the culture in which you live. And the more you understand what shaped you, at the same time that you begin to realize what your natural talents are. And it has to do, to start with your natural talents, is that you are drawn to do things in which you can be totally absorbed. It may be music, it may be art, it may be reading, it may be hiking, it may be out in nature, whatever it is. If it is something in you that you love, then whenever you are absorbed in it, you usually lose track of time. Very different from when you were in classes that you hated, and especially if it was the last one in high school, and you watched the clock tick tock until the bell rang. You knew you were doing time. Now, if you think about your own lives now, what are you doing when you lose track of time? What is it? What it is, where is it? Is it out in nature? Is it in home? Is it with people? Is it by yourself? What are you doing when you are so absorbed in whatever it is that you lose track of time? This is something very, very important to appreciate, because it involves who you are, loving what you are doing. And that is something that, especially from midlife on, you may have the choice of tilting your life in that direction. It's very different from living the life you were expected to live and conforming to it. And whether you can manage to do it or not, you can. If you can manage to do it and you get praised for becoming who your parents wanted you to be, or your culture wanted you to be, and at the cost maybe of suppressing and never developing some natural talents that you had in the first half of your life. But in the second half of your life, and during times like pandemic, when you can study anything that you might want to study, what is it that wants to grow and develop in you that is part of basically who you are, and that you are here at this time in history? I mean, this is an amazing time to be, for example, especially a woman, but also a man who doesn't quite fit in with the standard male model. It is a time when individuation, which is a Jungian big word, that really translates to me into becoming who you were meant to be, an individual that grew through the talents and life experiences and responses to life experiences that you grew through, and then here you are. And here we all are at a time where time is in between what was and what will be. That is where we all are living right now. This is what a pandemic story is about, especially when there are numbers of deaths and losses. And when life really changes, it's like you can't go back to what was before the pandemic, before whatever it was that happened to you happened to you. And then you're in this intermediate time where we all are, where human beings are, between the beginning of this pandemic and whatever comes next. Well, the word for that has been a favorite word of mine. The word is liminal. Liminal is a Latin word that mainly sort of applied to such things as the threshold. When you stepped from outside over the threshold into the house, there's a short threshold time, which is liminal. Well, liminal can be very long as well. Liminal can be from the time something happened that brought you to the hospital to the time when you can get out and get discharged. You're in between who you were and what next. And this is also true of all the educational experiences that most of you have had. That when you went away from your family to get educated, you were in a different world than you grew up in. And there was the experiences that you had in that education process, in that private school or in that public school or in that university. And what courses did you take out of love and talent that drew you to be interested in that? Or did you take them because this is what your parents expected you to do, and this is what you were kind of brought up to do and be? And having lived as long as I have, which I'm in my mid-80s now, I started out moving through history because I was Japanese American in California when World War II began with the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. And those people who were of Japanese ancestry on the west coast of California, and I understand, by the way, that there are a number of Japanese who came from Japan and other places and are in Brazil, caused by the kinds of turmoil that wars created. But anyway, for me, I was like 5 years old when World War II began with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which is the harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. And then what was declared was that all people of Japanese ancestry just on the West Coast had to show up with suitcases and be taken to intermediate places before they would then be put in what was called internment camps, but we referred to them as concentration camps. After all, there was barbed wire, there were armed guards, and it was in the middle of nowhere that people of Japanese ancestry were taken. I fortunately had unusual parents. I had a father who was a businessman activist when he was in college. And when his family needed him to go to work for the family company, he did. But he had a mind and an activity side of himself. And he and my mother were married, and my mother moved from New York to Los Angeles, where they met. And my mother was trained to be one of the few women physicians at Columbia University at that time. Came out to California, where because of prejudice, she had to practice within only the Japanese community. So there was something about the beginning of World War II, where if you were of Japanese ancestry, you were in a certain racial classification. And if you just paid attention to the history and didn't act on your own, what would happen to you would be that you would be taken away, bussed from where they kept you the first round, which happened to be for Southern California in the stables at the racetrack. And then from there to where the relocation concentration camps were created. Well, my parents moved out of Los Angeles just before everyone of Japanese ancestry in the LA County area were declared to be no longer having the rights of an American citizen. And we all had American citizenships. So my father got us papers to get us out of California. And what was interesting on hearing about it is that we went and stayed for a while near Sacramento, which was the state capital. He got papers that had to do with my mother's family being in New York, and they pledged that they would take care, if there's an economic problem, they would take care of us. So somehow, with those pieces of paper, we were free to leave the state. And we did via Los Angeles, where nobody even asked for papers. It's sort of like, okay, you were an Asian-looking person, but if you're around, you probably were Chinese, you were probably not Japanese. And so nobody even asked for the papers. And as soon as we got out of California and were in the rest of the United States, we were free American citizens again. Now, this has led me to go from my childhood through many different schools in New York State, in Colorado, in Denver, and in Grand Junction, Colorado, and for a while in Idaho, as my father made an effort of getting his relatives out of the relocation camps. And what I find very interesting about that and my own childhood is the re-entry into the many different schools and kind of waiting to see whether, with a little wariness, this really helps to be, again, back to the idea of the difference between an introvert and an extrovert. An introverted kid likes to stand back and see what is the nature of this game? How do you play it? Even what are the rules? The extroverted kid says, give me the ball, I want to play right now. And then they might find that they don't even like the game, but that's how they learn it. So if you happen to be more introverted by nature, chances are whatever life changes you all went through, the different schools, maybe your family had a divorce, maybe one member of the family got sick, maybe you had to go live with somebody else. Everybody has these kinds of experiences, usually somewhere in their lives. And it's part of the growing phase of adapting to and realizing the different times and places and experiences that you have growing from the time you were a child through high school. And high school, of course, is a time where you became aware of social sorts of things. What persona do you put on in order to be attractive? Do you fit that category or not? Or are you going to be the smart kid? Or are you going to be the troublemaker? I mean, all the thing about being in the years in high school is everybody has to sort of put on some kind of persona to have and belong to one group or another group, either by choice or by projection. So if you were a colored person, if your race was different, if you were if you were in some way not fitting the pattern of what a bright little girl or young woman should look like, for example, you became very sensitive about your attractiveness and things because you were being judged on that sort of thing. And everybody has gone through so many different phases of life, often not shared with other people. Most people try to put on a good persona or face when they go through schools. And then at home, life could be easy or it could be very difficult. One of the things about appreciating your own life is to put it in context and see what it was that you got through and what did you learn and what did you get involved in so that you could leave whatever was going on in the household, which might have been very painful. So if you were an introverted feeling or thinking person who could drop into a book and be in that book experience and tune out or listen to the radio or watch television or something like that, there's this sort of numbing out that most people get through some phases of their lives. And then here you all are, most in midlife. And by midlife, most people have achieved a lot or not of whatever it was they were set on a path to do, and it either worked or it didn't. And along the way, what did you learn about what really mattered to you? And did you take action yourself when it turns out that a relationship, a job, a place you were really was a mistake or not? I mean, these are the kinds of key things that shape us. It's not just what happens to us, but it's always how do we react to what happens to us? And the issue of becoming either feeling helpless and angry and depressed or seeing your way through in some way would have gotten you through to where you all are in midlife. And probably if you're spending time with Jungians on a program such as this, you've done a lot of coping, but you're also in midlife where what next? What are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? To get back to Mary Oliver's poem again. One's wild is the archetype that you came in with. It's never too late to take lessons in music just because you've never had a lesson before, but because you have a talent that was built in, you might find it to be really a wonderful thing to do. Or academically, it's not too late to become an expert at something you're fascinated with. And wild is that which is natural. It was just built in. It may need to have been in many ways shaped and developed, but that is certainly part of what matters when we develop parts of ourselves, is that it is who we are, only we are paying attention to developing it. And then there is this other part, the sense of considering your life precious, especially during a liminal time that we all are in. In many ways, most people think they can't make much of a difference or an impression. And yet people do all the time. They decide that politically it really does matter. In so many ways. Do you get involved with politics for the right reasons? If you do, then you may find yourself with other people. This is the other thing about appreciating your gifts, your talents, and your interests, is hoping that along the way, if you track and do what it is that matters to you, how very often you find kindred spirits. And this brings up the one other word in the title of this talk, which is about circle. That if you go back to recall how 1970 was known as the decade of the women's movement, because women in the late 60s to 70s started to meet together in what was called consciousness raising groups. Women talked about the truth of their experiences in their lives. Their activism got stirred up. They marched. They did things that women never had done before. And the 70s became the decade of the women's movement. And it did make a big difference to lots of individual women who then went on to universities, went on to professions, went on to do things that they might not have done at all if it hadn't been for the women's movement of the 1970s. Because I remember when I went to college, the fundamental idea was you're supposed to get your MRS degree. Do you remember that, any of you? You went to college not to get educated, not to get to be a professional anything, but to get your MRS degree, because that is what a woman should do. Well, in the 70s, the women's movement began. And the truth was that they met in circles and talked. And many times they were angry, many times they were crying, many times they were concerned about something that they wanted to make a difference with. And that's what they did. And then it kind of went quiet again after the 70s, because individuals went into different programs and things, and they started coming out after midlife in this 21st century. And now for the first time, you can look around the United States, and I'm not sure what it's like in Brazil, but in the United States, we suddenly have, we have women governors, we have a woman vice president, we have a number of women judges, we have a lot of women professionals. That wasn't the way it used to be. And we all are moving, whether we're in the Southern Hemisphere or Northern Hemisphere. The global warming is happening. The Antarctic Circle, with all of its ice mass, is melting. The oceans are rising. The major cities in South America are often close to water. And the water is going to rise, or is already rising. And the question really is if we're still here, if we're men and women who care about others, who care about the next generation and the generation after, who care about nature, there are billions of water animals who have apparently not survived the rising temperatures of the waters already. So there are all of these things that are happening. We are in transition, and getting back again to that impression that I wanted to raise with the threshold idea between where we were and where we're going. And this, especially the word liminal, which was the Latin word for threshold. And the threshold being now in America, given that in March of 3 years ago, I came back from Egypt, where I had gone for a conference and had returned in March. And the pandemic was announced as having begun. I had 1 day of practice in my office before shutting down the office, and doing my practice from that point on virtually. Thanks to the sort of thing that we are using right now, we can meet people, we can talk to people, we can do therapy in this way. And one of the things that is happening is that people, women who live in communities where they don't know each other very well, can organize through something like this. Or what's interesting is what's been happening is in this liminal time between what was and what next isn't happening. We don't know what next. So we're right in the sort of middle place. There's this whole possibility about knowing people, at least in the with Brazil being about and the United States both being huge geographies. You could go to school with somebody and then find that they are 1,000 miles away where they live now. Except now with such things as these gadgetries that allow us to talk to one another, you could call a circle of close friends that you were close friends were back in college or back in some kind of time in your life when you can think about one or two that you still are in touch with. And can you consider starting a circle with each of you in the circle, thinking of a few others that might join the circle? And this has been growing. One of the things about circles, or any idea at all, for example, the word circle is now part of the American language about group. Instead of groups, it's women's circles. And they are forming and keep forming easier and easier. But one thing about circles versus a therapy group is that you don't need to have a therapist running the group, and you choose who's going to be in it. And so somewhere along the way, I had written The Millionth Circle, how to change ourselves in the world. And it was adopted by people who already were in organizations and things, and used it as a basis of the idea of women's circles. The Millionth Circle is an idea. It's the tipping point. It's the one in which that idea of having an equal voice. In so many standard patriarchal families, the patriarchy is listened to and other people remain quiet. Or you go to an auditorium and the political person stands behind the podium on stage and everybody is facing him. Increasingly, sometimes there's a her these days, which is nice. But anyway, otherwise you just face the leader and you do what the leader suggests or says or requires. Well, that's patriarchy and that's hierarchy. And most families up until now under patriarchy often were shaped in that same way. It was a patriarchal shape. The parent with the power ran the show. But then when you start to have a circle where each person can speak and everybody faces one another and is honest, what happens is that people get to be much more real to one another. And for women who are in like patriarchal worlds or worlds in which they've never been personally sort of given credit for or been particularly valued, when she gets into a circle and can talk about what her dream is that she would like, the circle can hold it. And once the circle becomes a trustworthy one, it is like whatever is said in circle, it's like therapy is also a sacred place. With the idea that in the center of a circle is the archetype in Jungian terms of the self. And the self is also the source in which all of the religions are based, that along the way there was a connection with the archetype of God or goddess, the self, that which is spiritual, centering, and has been in many places known by different names. But that's just an archetypal energy, like all the other archetypes that we come into the world with. We have a natural affinity for what Jung happened to call the self, and it could be called God, goddess, all that is, the invisible realm, all of that. So what if you do meet in circle and you tell what you hope and what you're going through and what the pain is, and you ask her for meditation or prayers at the very end, you start to bring in the energy, the invisible. And when you do that, there's something about feeling supported, not just by the women or the men and women in the small group. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous had the same pattern. They didn't meet in circles, but circle energy was pretty much it. Everybody accepted that they needed help from one another and from the great power, because they did not have it themselves to be sober. Well, that's a model that's worked very well when nothing else did for quite a number of people. And that is also the basis of, say, women's circles and men's circles, where talking about truth and dropping the persona that you have to present to other people. In Jungian terms, you know, the persona is what the masks were in Greek theater. When they put on the mask, you knew who that person was supposed to be. And that's what a persona is. It is the mask that hopefully is permeable and that it really is a lot like you really are. But it is what you present to people you don't know very well, and it's to the world, your persona. And then there is a substance behind it, and the spiritual side behind it, and the dreams of who you want to be and who you could be and what you want to accomplish. And when you start to think, as I do, okay, time goes by very fast. In fact, the younger you are, the slower it goes. And then the older you are, the faster it goes. So as you get older, it really is like zip, how a year goes by. And you're a year older than you were before. So what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life when the whole world is in crisis and you still have some talents? There's a combination between the acts that make you feel like you matter because you are helping people or you are developing yourself or something. And what is it really? I mean, what I'm hoping to do just by talking as I am is to stir up the awareness that we are all in this liminal time between the beginning of the pandemic and we don't know what the ending will be. But what we human beings do now can shape what will happen next. And if you do something that you know is meaningful to you as you do it, then you also have a feeling that you're living a life that's worth being involved in. And so that's really what I think of as being what it is that happens in people's individual Jungian individuation kind of stories of life. As often as if they got through into successful adulthood, but the cost was what they suppressed in childhood or in adolescence or whenever, and is responsible for the anxiety and the depression and the bad dreams that bring them into a Jungian analytic therapy. And then in the process of remembering what they tried to suppress because they couldn't handle it when they were younger, now in adulthood, it's possible to start dreaming, for example. And in the dreams, people come up that you need to remember what's important, had a positive or negative influence on you. And here they are in your dream life. Or you have to translate dreams into a different language than the left brain linear language, because it's always the right brain that brings up images and brings up feelings. And if you dream and you have significant dreams that often then speak in metaphor about the bigger picture in which you are living, because what you are being presented with is a much bigger challenge than ordinary life. And for you to take it in and to feel it, and to then keep on wondering and dreaming and connecting with what it is that you came to be and do. I mean, I think that maybe, sometimes you get a sense, at least I do, that there are young souls and old souls. And I think that most people who started out on a more introverted side and came into feeling sort of not going along with everybody and then got involved in matters Jungian, I have a feeling that you do have a sense that this is not your one and only lifetime. You probably had previous lives as well, only none of us, or some of us, most of us don't remember previous lives. But did we decide to come in now? Did we decide to come in so we are here now, right when the planet is in crisis, when we have been educated, when we can make a difference in whatever big or small world we're in? Is that why we're here? Why are we here? What are we to do with our one wild and precious life now? All of these are questions worthy of challenging you from inside out, and taking a risk of speaking up, or taking a risk of moving, or taking a risk of applying for a different position, or taking a course in which some of your relatives will laugh at you. Why are you going back to school? Or will you be suppressed, or will you decide, no? If you have a circle of support who listen to you and feel for you and don't push, but support whatever it is that you are deciding yourself what to do, it really, really helps. And also it really helps to have a circle of support in which everyone in it has known you for many decades and known what you have gone through with maybe a previous marriage, maybe the death of a child, maybe the end of this or of that. And it's shared knowledge, and you have the support of this circle that you chose to be in. So I think I've covered a number of different things that may stimulate other questions, may allow me to talk about some other things that I might end up talking about. And what I would like is that we think about the liminal times we are in right now. because everybody, by the way, every time you, for example, graduated from high school and went somewhere else, or graduated from college and went somewhere else, when you left where you were, that was familiar, and you went to whatever next, you went through a liminal time where you weren't sure about what this in between was going to be. If you were looking for a job and you were out there interviewing, but you didn't know where you would end up doing, you were that in between place. Well, I'm suggesting that everybody, every human being on this planet right now is in one way or another experiencing a liminal in-between time between what was and what next, and are influenced by it in some way. And it means that we are here at a very special time where maybe it matters, where each person, like a grain of sand, depending on what pile it goes into, will make a difference. So we are in a crisis, which in script, I think it is in Chinese characters, crisis is danger and opportunity. I mean, that's what, and we're all in some kind of a crisis, as the planet is, humanity is, and we individually probably are at some level as well. We're in a crisis time where there's danger and opportunity. And it is not just crisis, but it is threshold. It is in between what was and what could be. And maybe we each can influence that as well. So on that thought, I'm going to be open to whatever and anyone has to ask or say, or and however that's done here.
Obrigado, Jan, pela sua palestra. Fiquei sentindo falta de você mostrar aquele sino que você me mostrou anteriormente. Aquela peça redonda que você me mostrou antes da gente começar. Lembra?
It's a bowl. It's not a bell. And I just hit it. And it resonates at the heart chakra. Now, the heart chakra is in the center of the chest.
Pessoal, abertas perguntas. Quem quiser fazer a pergunta, bota o nome no chat e eu chamo para a pessoa poder fazer a pergunta. Jean, queria começar com uma questão para você. Você falou que na década de 60, e 70, houve essa explosão do movimento feminista, particularmente nos Estados Unidos, enfim. Você sente diferenças entre essa geração dos 60, da década de 60, da década de 70, com a geração atual? São as mesmas reivindicações? São as mesmas... os propósitos são os mesmos? Ou você acha que alguma coisa mudou nessa lacuna de espaço entre esses dois movimentos? O da década de 70 e o atual, o movimento feminista.
It has a lot to do with the individual and whether she has a goal that she wants to meet. It's much easier to reach a goal now than it was in the 1970s. We do now have women models in most kind of careers. Women have entered just about every career there is. So we can, and that's one thing you need to also realize, that you may be a model yourself for younger women. And if you encourage them to follow your example, especially when they came from a background in which women were always the natural wife and mother. But things are changing in general. So yes, it is different. It is they're qualities that are very similar with the idea of women gathering together and getting energy to make a difference. There was an excitement back in the 70s. And now there's a push against some real difficult times. Women really began marching again in the United States when the 40-something year tradition that was a legal thing called Roe v. Wade, in which women had the right to make their own decision about having a child or not if they got pregnant. It got taken away just weeks ago. What is it like in Brazil? Can women voluntarily have abortions?
Não.
No.
É ilegal no Brasil.
Well, the case that became the first case where an abortion was performed out of state, because the Roe v. Wade principle that allowed women to have abortions applied to all of the United States. The current Supreme Court eliminated 47 years of Roe v. Wade and said it's up to each individual state. So we have states in which abortion is forbidden and states where you can have an abortion. And there was a 10-year-old child who was incested, got pregnant in a state where you couldn't have an abortion, who went to a doctor in another state where it was legal, and the doctor did it and stood up for doing it, especially after the politicians said that it was fake, and it wasn't. She was only 10 years old and she was raped. And those laws don't apply now that the new laws are coming in into the states that want to keep women. I mean, really, if you can't decide yourself whether you're going to be a mother or not, if you can't avoid being raped, if you physically got an illness and if you get pregnant on top of it, it probably is going to kill you, and there's no consideration for that, all of a sudden you become so aware that you as a woman don't have a right to your own life. You are there to carry a baby if you're pregnant. However you got pregnant, however the health of the child or you are.
A gente viveu uma situação bem parecida aqui no Brasil, com uma criança de 11 anos também, que foi estuprada e encontrou resistências na justiça para que ela pudesse fazer o aborto necessário. Enfim, Pessoal, muitas perguntas. Eu vou pedir para as pessoas serem breves na pergunta, para a gente dar tempo de todo mundo poder ter espaço para perguntar, tá bom? Lu, contigo, por favor.
Prazer, Jean. Eu sou a Luciana Ximenes, eu sou organizadora.
Hi, Lucian.
Junto com o Marcos. É um prazer enorme te receber. Muito obrigada pela tua palestra. Eu tenho duas perguntas, na verdade. Você usou duas palavras que eu fiquei pensando se elas não poderiam ser usadas juntas, que é individuação e militância. Eu fiquei pensando se é possível uma mulher individuar no patriarcado sem militância. Essa é uma pergunta que eu queria te fazer. Posso emendar outra? Aí você responde as duas? Vou fazer outra.
Can I answer that question?
Okay.
Individuation is really becoming who you came into the world with, the natural talents, the natural abilities, the natural kinds of both physical and psychological kinds of things you came into the world with, and the dreams that affect you and all. So to track the individuation, it's to be aware of the kinds of energies that you actually have, or the skills, or the intelligence, or the talents, and they are your gifts, but you have to develop them. They're useful and helpful and wonderful, but you also have to develop them. So that is like an individuation. Activism is something that has to do with almost everyone, whether they are quite introverted or naturally activist, extroverted, when something happens and it matters whether you speak up or act up or stay silent, you're making a decision. Often we all have to live with the decisions we make. And sometimes it's a wiser decision not to be active right now, given the circumstances that you're in and everything. But it's a choice. So it's a choice. As is, individuation is a multiple choice kind of a thing. It's all the many different qualities that you have, and whether you and when you use them. But activism has to do with a particular situation and your situation, and is this the time for you to step up or not? And you usually know from inside out whether this is the time or not. And there was a second question.
A segunda pergunta é que você estava usando a questão do círculo como uma coisa horizontal, né? Sem hierarquização e sem um líder. E eu fiquei me perguntando se não é muitas vezes necessária a presença de um líder como referência num círculo.
No.
Não?
For example, you probably all have been with, say, 3 or 4 others in various situations. And in many of them, it's just natural that everybody speaks up about what movie they want to go to and why, or do they want to do this at school, or do they want to do this at camp, or whatever it is. And everybody speaks up, and there's an ability to sort of get along and talk it through and decide what. Then there sometimes are groups in which some woman acts like a patriarch. and everybody defers, but then you never hear from everybody. So like I'm thinking about the Millionth Circle, which is been alive for 20 years. They happened to come across my book at a conference in South Africa. And they had a discussion about there ought to be an organization or something. And so they talked about it there, and then they came back to the United States. And I was called by somebody that I hadn't met before, and she told me about the experience at the Parliament of World Religions in South Africa, and how the issue of circle was discussed, and how they want to form a circle organization in the United States, and can we use the title The Millionth Circle? Well, I had a spontaneous yes. I mean, I talked to her on the phone. I got a sense it felt right to me. I said yes, and I would like to come to the first organizational meeting, but I can't stay, because I had, at that point, my son was in the last phases of his life after a combination of a certain kind of illness and a fall. And so I was not going to spend much time, but I did spend enough time to meet them. And I also knew who was at the Parliament of World Religions and were part of the initial group, because I'd met them and knew them before. And so the book, The Millionth Circle, became the fundamental idea behind it. And it's been busy and out there, and I think of it as sort of a seed packet. It's an unusual seed packet because it doesn't lay down rules and things. It looks more like it's written in verse, which it sort of is. But basic to the idea is that the circles grow and they affect others, and the image on the cover is like dropping the image on the cover is like dropping a pebble in the pond, you know. The pebble drops in the pond, and then circles grow out from it. And it actually has been happening a lot. There are a lot of women's circles, and now men's circles, and men and women's circles, but mostly circles are much easier for women as a whole to start a circle, and often to think and feel about when they could meet and how often, but they need an experience of being together for 3 or 4 times and then deciding whether to continue. Because once you decide whether to continue, it can be for the rest of your life. A women's circle is like that it's like deep women's friendships in which you don't put on a persona. You talk about what really is important in your life. And you learn and know that you can trust the other women in the circle, that it's not about gossip. It's about knowing the ups and downs of being a woman, going through the changes that happen and things that happen to you, and also to in silence call upon prayer, because divinity is really just, it's like human beings are related to whatever divinity is, and divinity's energy is so much greater than any human's ability to really dominate it or something. That the invisible world, I mean, this gets into the idea of, we have a left brain which is linear and logical, and we have a right brain which is full of images. It isn't logical. It holds opposites. It holds complementaries. It is the primary imagery maker of our dream life usually. And when we listen to both sides of our brains, and we happen to have a part between them that are joined together in our brains, there's something about realizing the gifts we have of intelligence and intuition and the capacity to feel what is sacred or feel what is energy around something. I mean, I think it's very easy for an intuitive, for example, to start to sense the energy of other people or places. I mean, I remember years and years ago where I didn't even consider that I was using this sort of gift, but looking at new houses, I remember walking into some houses that were perfectly fine, but the energy in the house was really bad. I couldn't say why, but you know, if it probably had something to do with what had happened in that house. And then when I went to Europe for the first time, and when I by then was midlife, was a psychiatrist, was a Jungian analyst, and I did not use what I learned I had until I went to Chartres Cathedral and could begin for the first time to feel the energy, where the energy in that cathedral was the greatest. And this is new to me. It's like I picked up energy. My body was like a tuning fork because my body had not been violated, really. It was healthy, and I had not used it in this way. But when I went to Chartres Cathedral for the first time, and then to many more cathedrals after that, I started to sense where the energies were and how, when I stood where the energies were, it was like there was a mutual infusion or something like that. And I still do that. I can still kind of go and feel energies that are positive and all. And so I can start bringing in things that are a bit on the weird side, but then I also remember the word weird comes from WRRYD, and they were the weird sisters. They were the three weird sisters of medieval times that somehow picked up the visible world. And I think there are lots of you who probably are not just intuitive, but that you do have that kind of capacity to pick up energies. And often you've been trained to disregard them and to not trust your own sense. This is why I like to hit the bell so that you feel the central heart chakra, because I think that is really that part of us that when we're with somebody that we really trust and love, we can feel it sometimes as a pressure in our chest, or sometimes as a deep glow or something. And it's true of places too. So when I learned that I could use my heart chakra as a tuning fork to know where the energy in a certain cathedral was the greatest, and by feeling the energy, it sort of did something positive for me too. So I don't mind as I get older sounding weirder and weirder. and because there is something about this whole realm of intuition, of feeling, of knowing and not having to be defensive about it at all or force it on anybody else. It's like being moved by music, which you happen to hear and someone else doesn't. Or now in a time where the trees may not last, to start to feel your way wherever you live. If there's any tree or trees that have a certain energy that you like, you've noticed their beauty and felt for it, But somehow then to be outside and to feel it, it is like visiting a sacred place. And there's sacred places all over this planet. There are also awful places all over this planet. I remember going to one small island and going into some place on that island and really feeling like, this is like going into a house where bad things had happened. I mean, we can pick up such things like that. Well, that was a long enough answer. I don't know. I hope there weren't a whole lot more questions because I sort of used up a lot of the time.
Obrigado, Lu. Temos várias perguntas, Gê. Vamos lá, pessoal. De novo, repetindo, para a gente puder ser um pouco mais breve, para dar tempo de todo mundo perguntar. Mirtes, por favor.
Obrigada, Marcos. Me ouvem direitinho? Dá para ouvir
Sim,
direitinho?
perfeito.
Sim. Primeiro de tudo, quero agradecer a ti, Marcos, a Luciana, pela generosidade de abrir esse espaço, né? Porque é maravilhoso, sempre maravilhoso. Jean, estou super feliz de poder falar pessoalmente contigo, que maravilha, é uma honra, né? Eu trabalho com uma metodologia chamada biodança, que é uma metodologia corporal, que trabalha com a subjetividade também, e já faz muitos anos, é um trabalho de grupo, né? E faz muitos anos que eu trabalho, desde os anos 80 praticamente, que trabalho com grupos de mulheres, especificamente com grupos de mulheres, em algumas ocasiões, né? Tenho grupos de homens e mulheres, e alguns grupos só de mulheres. Isso aconteceu até 2018, 2019. Nesse período, eu comecei a sentir que já os círculos que eram só de mulheres começavam a não ter sentido, existia uma exigência de uma participação mais diversa, né? E nesse momento, mesmo com temas femininos, né, por exemplo, agora a gente está com um grupo de estudos sobre o livro Mulheres que Correm com os Lobos, mas eu deixei de pedir que isso fosse só uma participação feminina, e alguns homens resolveram participar, e essa participação masculina está sendo muito bonita, muito interessante. Então, eu acho que é um outro momento histórico, diferente daquele dos anos 90, né? Onde, início dos anos 2000, onde tinha muita vontade desses grupos só para homens, só para mulheres. Agora, eu sinto que é mais... que tem um clamor por diversidade dentro dos grupos. Existe uma coisa maior, né, que supera um tipo de masculinidade, outro tipo de masculinidade, de feminilidade, mas existem masculinidades, feminilidades, né? Então, toda a questão de gênero, eu sinto que está afetando muito essa questão dos grupos e nos faz pensar muito, né? Então, eu gostaria da tua opinião sobre isso. Obrigada.
Well, I'm thinking about in the United States, many men who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, some even in their 50s, had mothers who had been influenced by feminism and who raised their boys to be, and their girls, to have both sides, so that the girls are playing competitive sports and the boys can do art if they want to. There's a whole thing about, there's been more freedom since the women's movement in the 20th century, back in the 1970s, to raise children to be able to do and be their natural selves rather than shaping them up into being acceptable, but there are lots of families that still do that, that still require the boys to behave like boys, and we encourage the boys to go into certain fields, but we just want girls to be attractive and to find a fine husband. But then there are so many families that have had to go through divorce and remarriage and all that, so that there's much more flexibility. But I am surprised to find that it's generalized.
Obrigado, Mirtes. Duda Doreia, tudo bom? Tá por aí?
Sim, estou por aqui. Tudo bem?
Oi, Andréia, tudo bom?
Sou eu? Posso falar?
Pode falar, tudo bem?
Tudo jóia. Bom, eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta que tem a ver com uma esfera política muito recente, que é a questão da transgeneralidade. Então, a questão dos gêneros, né? E como... Do gênero.
Oh,
das
right,
pessoas trans.
right.
E como as políticas que estão sendo criadas atualmente para a inclusão de pessoas trans estão afetando as mulheres, especialmente com a questão da autodenominação. Então, como a autodenominação de gênero afeta as mulheres, e eu gostaria muito de ouvir a sua opinião a respeito disso.
I don't have a real sharp opinion. I'm realizing that there's a certain quality of kids who may just be playing with the idea of being boy or girl, and there really needs to be more than an impulse, but a kind of deeper certainty before one goes through the whole process of gender, physical surgery and things like that. But that's a very individual choice that somebody must make. I think that what's important is a culture that allows people to be who they are. If they feel that they are transgender people and they really want to go through the ordeal of surgery and all to be who they deeply feel inside they are, that is a choice that they have and should have a choice. But I also sometimes wonder, since I am this sort of mystical, semi-mystical person, to assume that we have all been, most of us have had many different lifetimes, and they probably might not have all been of the same gender. Could we not at some point have been of the opposite gender? And is that why we have a strong Jungian term, animus, a very familiar quality of the male side? But that you, regardless of how, I don't know, there's something about having the body that you have, coming into the world with it and feeling this is my body, and how much of it, maybe it depends on being a sensate rather than an intuitive, that you actually have to have the surgery in order to feel right by yourself. But can't you possibly come into the world in the gender that's obviously the one that you came into this life with, and develop those feminine qualities that you are naturally drawn to? I don't know. I think there must be a narrow range of people that are so sensate that they can't feel how they are without changing their body shape and things. But one of the things that seems to be happening is it seems to be eroding the idea of the value of the feminine right now, in some ways. So I don't know. But hearing about people's children, not that I have a huge, because during this period, there's not a lot of social talk. So I'm very much aware of at least one person I know whose child is wants to be called him, her, they, and is and is only 13 and is in this in-between gender place. And since she was a little girl, or so it seemed up until this time, is this really a time for surgery, or is this a phase? I mean, but it's her life too.
O que eu penso, que eu gostaria muito de ouvir é sobre a implicação dessa liberdade que é necessária e é importante para as pessoas, que elas possam escolher quem elas sentem que são, nas políticas públicas que afetam as mulheres de fato, quando a gente tem situações de colocar competidores que têm uma fisiologia masculina na categoria de mulher, por exemplo. Mas agradeço muito a resposta.
Could you reframe the question for me?
Sobre como as mulheres estão sendo afetadas concretamente por políticas públicas de inclusão de gênero, que são necessárias, mas como você falou, são questões individuais, e como as questões individuais das pessoas estão afetando o espaço público do lugar da mulher no mundo.
Oh, yeah. As in women's sports, where you have very talented male body that gets transformed into a female body and has the strength of the man, and somehow it's taking over a lot of women's sports. There probably could be an intermediate group of trans people, athletes, who could compete themselves rather than be either entering the female side and then taking it over, because that doesn't feel right to have just because there was a transgender surgery, that when the body strength and everything can overcome any athletic woman, that doesn't seem like they now are a women's sport star. What about something in between? What about a genuine kind of competitiveness? I don't know. I don't know what the Olympic Committee is going to do or anything with that sort of thing.
Obrigado, Andréa. Vamos lá, a gente tem várias perguntas ainda. Silvana, contigo, querida.
Oi, muito feliz de estar aqui, e eu queria mostrar uma coisa antes de fazer minha pergunta. Este livro, o Anel do Poder, eu tenho o seu autógrafo aqui, não sei se dá para ver, a sua assinatura, de quando você esteve no Brasil. E eu fui...
what was the date on it? The year?
Em 93, eu acho, 1993. Então, eu estou muito feliz em vê-la novamente, que eu estive naquela época, né? Naquela ocasião, num grupo, numa casa, foi muito especial. Fizemos um workshop. você sempre me inspirou muito, então eu estou muito feliz. E eu queria comentar que você passa, com o seu livro Milionésimo Círculo, você passa uma esperança, né? Eu tenho a impressão que você traz uma visão otimista e esperançosa de uma mudança, né? Da mudança significativa. E você lá dá muitas dicas, né? Muitas instruções de como lidar com esse grupo. Eu já coordenei, já tive vários grupos de mulheres, muitos anos, teve um grupo que durou 10 anos, então, assim, aprendi muito com as suas, com o que eu li de você. Mas eu fico pensando qual seria o antídoto num grupo para não se cair nas questões do poder, né, da sombra, né, na linguagem nossa, na sombra, na competição, nas questões de poder mesmo, patriarcais, que a gente carrega dentro da gente. Então, essa seria uma pergunta. Então, é isso, tá bom? Não quero me alongar.
I personally think that you have to bring the sacred into the circle, that there has to be a spiritual aspect to do that, that there's for example, in our women's group, which is different than a group that meets and goes into problems and things like that. We talk about ourselves, but there are others that in our lives that we know about, and we might say something about it, but we don't go into it like we do a group therapy thing. And what we do is, towards the end, ask for prayers for this person, for example, or the members of the group itself talk about they're going through a kind of rough time of it and have to make up their minds about doing this or doing that. And the circle is not there to tell them what to do, but to support them to make the right decision and to ask for prayers for the rightness of it. I think there's, as soon as you start to bring in an energy that is not personally someone else's stronger opinion or something, it does make a difference to have at least a silent phase. In all these circles that I've led where there has been a silent phase, it doesn't always require, not everybody has a history of praying, but meditating or being silent, hearing what somebody is concerned. They're going to in for an operation next week, and they're anxious and they want it to turn out well, or they're worried about their child, or they're concerned about all the kinds of things that people are concerned about. And they share their concern without going into lots of details. And they trust the combination of, this is a group of people that don't gossip. I mean, that does make a difference. If it's not safe to bring up a problem in this circle, it's not a safe circle. There has to be a kind of clarity about such things as, it's only trustworthy when you can really say, I really feel vulnerable. I'm worried. I mean, sometimes it's like the routine. You're going in for a breast exam and you are afraid of the consequences. Well, you can share it with a group of women who care about you. And there's something about prayer, what it does, that we don't have control over what prayer does, but it's amazing on some of the transformative experiences that people have had with a mix of prayer and sharing it with others. And if it's a circle in which somebody is always the boss, I think that one question is to actually bring it up with the idea that certain people need to find their voice and lead it more. And then you can always leave. I mean, this is one of the things is, this is you're a volunteer person in the group and you can stay in it, try to transform it and decide, I know what a circle can be and this is not it. I'm going to go start another circle or something. I mean, we do that with all our significant relationships. And then we make a commitment to say one for the rest of our lives, maybe. Does that help at all?
Sim. Sim, eu usava o relato de mitos, os mitos, histórias, contos de fadas nos grupos, e isso acabava criando um padrão, não era padrão, mas uma atmosfera que às vezes ia para abria um canal para uma outra coisa, uma outra dimensão, que saía do pessoal só, individual. E eu acho que isso pode ser mesmo uma coisa muito transformadora, a sua ideia, né, dos círculos. Agora, como multiplicar isso, né, assim, como isso pode ser mais, né, multiplicador para o mundo, né, para o coletivo. Enfim, desculpem tomar o tempo.
Obrigado, Silvana. Jean, a gente tem mais umas 3 perguntas. Tudo bem para você?
I don't know. Depends on the questions.
Pode. Caprichem, pessoal, por favor. Mabel, contigo.
Oi, pessoal, boa tarde, tudo bem? Jean, muitíssimo obrigada pela sua fala, eu estou muito feliz de ter te assistido e eu vou imitar um pouquinho a Silvana, porque eu pedi para fazer essa pergunta, é um pouco fora do tema que você tratou hoje, mas, na verdade, eu conheci o seu trabalho através desse seu livro, chamado Close to the Bone.
Oh, Close to the Bone.
Eu encontrei...
It's the only book that I have changed. It has a different ending. Every single other book, I've not changed a single word in it. But that book, I did change. I did change the ending of it. And it had to do with the death of my son and how he had been heard from after.
Eu não sei se eu tenho a 10ª edição, eu não sei se é a edição que já tinha a modificação. Essa que eu tenho é a 10ª. Bom, de todo modo, eu me deparei com esse livro quando eu estive no Instituto de Zurich e eu tive que comprá-lo lá, porque eu trabalho com pacientes em cuidados paliativos oncológicos. Eu trabalho com isso há mais de uma década e encontrar com esse livro foi uma coisa muito importante. Assim,
With what?
Pacientes em cuidados paliativos por câncer.
Oh, okay, yes.
Então, eu pedi para te fazer uma pergunta hoje, que na verdade é um pedido, não sei se foge muito ao tema do que você veio falar, mas eu tinha vontade de te ouvir falar um pouco sobre esse livro, sobre esse trabalho do Close to the Bone.
Oh, I think it applies to, there probably isn't anybody here who hasn't been with someone who had a serious medical or surgical condition and may have made it through or died. Everybody has had parents and grandparents who aren't here anymore because they passed on. And so it's very much applies to what we're talking about, which is sort of like everyone's journey. We happen to be going through a pandemic at now, and the planet and individuals are in a particular difficult time. And at the same time, people with cancer are showing up, as they always do. People with diabetes or people who have a stroke, and it's harder and harder often to get medical care because the emergency rooms and the doctors are so limiting of space. So yes, I think it very much is like everything else, that when you come across a life-threatening illness, it is like being in a pandemic. It's different, but yet there is something very similar about addressing what the problem is, putting energy into, for example, I don't know if in the United States we are really going to do anything good about what we have done to the environment. And I also know that Brazil is cutting down too much of the rainforest. So whether we're about the planet being sick or an individual person has cancer and may or may not survive, it's very much the same in lots of ways as to where are you putting your energy, and will you do what's right for what you care about? And if you are taking care of a patient, that's one thing. But if you are an activist, an environmental activist, it's another thing. So it's very much the same in what's important and what's important to others other than maybe ourselves. Because if you're treating patients with cancer, then helping them to get through the treatment and potentially recover, that's what you're doing. And it has great value. And if that's your calling, it's great. I mean, the important thing is the overall picture is bigger than that. And so you can also be both a therapist or a nurse or a doctor in a cancer center, but you can also be an activist of any kind or just make a difference, whatever you're moved to do.
Muito obrigada, Jean. Foi prazer.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Mabel. Cris Viana, vamos lá?
Boa noite a todas. Jean, muito obrigada por existir neste mundo. Eu sou uma ativista desde
I'm having trouble
criança.
finding you. Where?
Hello?
This is Chris?
Yes?
Okay. There you are in the corner of my screen. Hello.
Então, comecei como criança como ativista ambiental e depois, hoje, me defino como uma militante feminista. Então, meu processo de individuação, ele passa completamente por essa militância feminista. No Brasil, depois da primeira onda sufragista, o movimento feminista também renasce, no caso, com os grupos reflexivos, que era como a gente chamava aqui, e depois tivemos Lélia Gonzalez, digamos assim, que é a nossa Angela Davis. Angela Davis, cada vez que vem no Brasil, se refere a Lélia Gonzalez. E depois disso, as mulheres foram para o mundo, né? Foram cada uma, né, para os seus trabalhos, ocupar os espaços públicos. No Brasil, elas tiveram importância fundamental para que a gente criasse o Sistema Único de Saúde, que é uma referência no mundo. E hoje, no país, nós temos mais de 50% de mulheres que se dizem feministas, apesar de a gente estar vivendo um momento muito regredido no feminino do Brasil, né, com um presidente muito misógino. Por que eu contei um pouco rapidamente essa história do feminismo no Brasil? Porque é um momento também que as feministas estão escrevendo sobre a sua história, talvez mais do que nunca, né, revivendo todo esse passado, mas também começa um movimento também de escrever o que a gente quer desse futuro, o que a gente quer depois desse limiar. E aí vem a minha pergunta, que é como o feminismo e a psicologia junguiana juntas podem pensar nesse novo mundo. Obrigada. Esse novo mundo de imagens, enfim.
Stumbling a little about the one-sidedness of feminism at this point, because it is what has had to rise in order to balance out and end patriarchal power. So feminism is in opposition to the standard patriarchal power over women. So to be a feminist after the first efforts in the United States, feminism became a bit of a dirty word. It was somehow a lot of women would withdraw and say, well, I am for this and this and this, but I'm not a feminist, because there was an image that was about feminism that made women look like a masculinized feminists or something like that. But that has changed. Now it has actually become a kind of much more neutralish word. So I don't know how it is where you are, whether feminism is a positive word or whether it carries a lot of negative imagery or something like that. It did for a while, and then it has been revived again in a positive way in the United States. So that's about feminism. And the other word is about Jungian, the Jungian side of things. Well, I've taken on the Jungian perspective slightly because there is the standard early Jungian assumes that your ego is you've got a feminine ego and then you have an animus, and your animus will always be less aware, less conscious, inferior in its development in a woman. Well, I not only wrote goddesses in every woman, I wrote gods in every man. And I wrote at the end in the goddesses in every woman that men will find a goddess that is part of them, and women in goddesses, gods in every man will find a masculine archetype that is one of theirs. For example, when I wrote goddesses in every woman, I felt each of the goddesses I wrote about as a part of me, so I could describe it as it felt like to me. And what was missing was at least one male archetype that happens to be Hermes. I couldn't be having fun talking to countries like I'm doing now, putting it into words, if I didn't have a highly conscious Hermes, the messenger god. And so I see everyone as really, I mean, I keep thinking I should have written a book, but it would have been such a fat book called Gods and Goddesses in Every Person. And then you could kind of choose which of the archetypes really belong to you, energize you. And then gender is different than the archetypes, although there's mostly they do obviously blend together. So the mother archetype is usually a motherly woman, but then there are men who have a motherly quality. So it's like, I don't see that there's any, I think what I've done is in Jungian thinking, expanding the limited assumption that anima and animus is not just contrasexual part of a person, but is always an inferiorly undeveloped part. It's not. So it matches, it is quite fine, you know, it's, I think about all the masculine, the one archetype that if it joins the ones that are most prominent in me, it is Hermes. Hermes is a wanderer. He travels. He observes. He has words. He's very much like the me that you're talking to, except that I'm me, you know, and I'm not a he. I'm a she. But there isn't a single, the feminine archetype's the only one that's verbal. It is more than likely the thinking side of, the thinking feminine, Athena. But I've never been one of these, but Athena as a archetype likes to be where power is in the big city, doesn't like to be out in the country, doesn't like to be create art for art's sake or expression. She's creative, but everything she creates is very practical. So I don't, my artistic side does not go through Athena, it goes through other parts of me. So I think that you really, you can find in men a feminine archetype, but there are men who are strong Demeters, for example. They have a strong maternal within their fatherly or brotherly side. So everybody can find in amongst the archetypes that I've written about, which are the major ones in Greek mythology, you can find a contrasexual archetype that fits and helps fill out that sense of who you are as patterns inside. I'm glad I was asked the question.
Muito obrigada. Eu acho que o feminismo é isso, né? Pensar outros mundos e um mundo não binário, né? Entre todas as coisas que a gente precisa pensar, né? Obrigada.
Obrigado, Cris. Pessoal, eu vou dar voz aqui ao Daniel, que é a única pergunta de um homem ainda que não... quer dizer, a única que apareceu aqui, então acho importante dar voz também aos homens, tá? Por favor. Daniel, está por aí?
Daniel sim.
Vamos lá, Daniel.
Daniel,
eu estou com a câmera com problema, por isso que eu não consegui abrir. A questão, acho que até já respondeu, né, dessa questão das possibilidades dos arquétipos irem para além dos gêneros. E nas religiões, na mitologia iorubá, tem os arquétipos também da transexualidade, dos gêneros não binários. Então, como é que a gente pode ampliar essa individuação para uma sociedade que reflete outros tempos? Né? Pensar nesses grupos mais fragilizados, que não só os do cisgênero, da mulher cisgênero, né? tem esses outros grupos que são marginalizados e como é que a gente pode pensar nessa individuação, já que nos convida a uma transformação, né? Então, minha pergunta é essa.
Oh, I think it does. I think what it allows is for both genders to be wider and deeper in what they do with their lives than when restricted to what a male should be and what a female should be.
Obrigado, Daniel. Tá? Jan, 2 últimas perguntas, prometo, 2 últimas. Érica e depois Karina, por favor. Érica.
Ok.
Érica está aí?
Olá,
Olá, Érica.
tudo bem? Jean, uma felicidade enorme essa possibilidade de estar contigo nessa tarde. Grata por essa oportunidade ao Instituto. Jean, eu sou gestora ambiental já há 25 anos e atuo nas políticas públicas ambientais no Brasil, especificamente na Bahia, há 20 anos. E eu estou criando uma mentoria onde eu acredito que para o ativismo ambiental é fundamental a gente ter as técnicas e as estratégias sobre o conhecimento sobre as questões ambientais, né? Mas eu sou também analista junguiana, formada já há 2 anos, e eu queria que você pudesse me falar como, do seu ponto de vista, como a gente pode trazer a abordagem junguiana para fazer essa junção, né, do conhecimento técnico ambiental e engajar as pessoas no ativismo ambiental, engajar para que elas atuem de fato nos apoiando enquanto gestores públicos nas políticas públicas ambientais. E eu queria saber a sua opinião de como a abordagem junguiana pode nos auxiliar nesse sentido.
Well, I think from a standpoint of environmental activism, the chances are that the archetypes that in the women that are most active doing this has a lot to do with having had a close connection with nature. I don't know how many, I mean, a great many women have been raised in cities and have been raised with families that are very culturally involved in culture and cities and not in nature. And if you're an environmentalist, you love the natural environment that this planet has created for us. And so how do you recruit people to be an environmentalist? Well, one of the things is I think that it depends a lot on whether young women, I mean, I think about the importance of being a Girl Scout when I was a kid and living under the trees out of doors and things like that, and seeing the stars at night you couldn't see them from the cities because the city glow just blocked out the sky, but you go up in the mountains and you see the Milky Way and it's gorgeous and it's a privilege to be up there, say. Well, when you love nature, to be an environmentalist is that you help protect what you love. If you love children, you are helping children to survive whatever abuse they're getting. So you have to love what you want to save. And as you do it, you really feel like what you're doing has meaning. Now, I don't know how many Jungians have a connection to nature, whether they were introverted and citified, or whether they were like me, had experiences up in the mountains and out in nature and loved it. or in their solitude climbed up a tree and enjoyed being out where there wasn't all those people around. So how do you find environmentalists that are Jungians? Is I'm not sure, but I think that you have to give yourself as an up, you have to be an example yourself about how you can be a Jungian and how your cause can be what it is. So go do that, And also the thing about a lot of Jungians don't seem to be active enough. And I think that it really might, because if you start out with somebody who's essentially introverted thinking or introverted feeling, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to bring them out to connect with what you're talking about, which is environment. But one of the interesting things about Jungians is they often don't share with other Jungians what their interests are that don't fit under Jungian. So when you get to know Jungians well, you often find, oh yeah, there's some people there that are like me, They don't talk about it, but they are environmentalists like me, not as serious, in the work as you have been in your line of work, but very much serious in terms of being people who go into the environment on their vacations and in their introversion love often being out in nature by themselves. So I'm not sure how you're going to recruit them, but there are some that are there. But you do have to share your own story often. And then there's some hesitation and then some speaking up.
Grata, Jean. Eu sou extrovertida, intuição e sentimento. Função, sensação inferior.
Obrigado, Érica. Jean, última pergunta, tá? Para a gente fechar o nosso encontro.
Thank you.
Karina. Chegou sua vez, Karina.
Nossa, nem acredito. Meu Deus do céu. Bom, primeiramente, queria agradecer a você, Marcos e a Luciana, por esse evento maravilhoso. Jean, também, de estar podendo falar com você, para mim, é um prazer. Eu fico até emocionada, que eu sou muito fã, assim, do seu trabalho, eu acompanho, né? Então, muito gostoso estar aqui. E a minha pergunta eu queria saber se você percebe o desenvolvimento atual muito individualizado, se as pessoas elas têm buscado o seu desenvolvimento de uma forma muito individualizada dentro dos seus processos, inclusive até com uma certa intolerância das questões humanas, com outros humanos, né? E se sim, como você vê a possibilidade de trazer a confluência entre o ser individual e o ser coletivo através dos círculos?
If I understand the question, I think it would be very helpful for individuals to trust those in a circle and have the circle and its support. Because a circle, especially one with a spiritual center and one that you end up trusting, whatever comes up, you can share it with them. And we use the expression, and they have my back. It means that you're deciding to speak up as an activist in some way, and you might run into anger or retribution. But if you've had a chance to really talk about why you are wanting to speak up about this, and you were able to think it through, and be as centered as you possibly can be and expressive at the same time, then it's very helpful to have the circle behind you, that the circle has your back. You let them know when you are going to have this confrontation, if it amounts to a confrontation. And the circle not only has your back, but knows what it is that you are about to try to do. And those that have a sense of prayer give you prayer and energy that you might succeed. I think it helps a lot.
Eu fico só pensando em como trazer essa ideia dos grupos para o movimento atual que a gente tem, porque tem um movimento também muito desse lado muito individual, de você crescer individualmente, de você fazer as coisas individualmente. Então, como trazer isso, da importância desse coletivo, de você tem esse apoio, sabe?
Oh. What's surprising is that there, at least in the United States, the word circle is used very often these days, and not group or meeting or something like that. And if every time you meet in circle, especially with a sacred center, it's one more circle energy that you're contributing to the bigger picture of the collective unconscious. I mean, the collective unconscious depends on people doing something that starts out with it's, nobody's doing this sort of thing. And then some people are doing it, and then more people are doing it, and then it catches on. And there are lots of books about circle and rules about circle. And I think the general rules about circle are on the Mayan Circle website, which is we've kind of neglected, but it exists, and it does have the sort of principles of circle on it, which I also did put in the book, but not in a straightforward way, but in a much more poetic way. So once you are in a circle, it actually feels good. I mean, that's the reason why a person would be in a circle. And it doesn't need to meet regularly, and you need to prepare to be in a circle and what that might mean, to listen and to talk about what's really going on that matters to you, and to feel that people care about you and what you're talking about. And it helps every individual to be in such a circle. But then there can be like some person dominating it and things like that. And then there has to be whole issues of either breaking up or taking it on or whatever. But I just think that it's a very good thing to have to be, it also has to do with the more women are involved in taking care of other people and job, it's harder and harder to have individual friendships and keep up with them. But if you have good and deep connections with, say, 5 other women, or maybe it's one of the exceptional groups that you talk about in Brazil, where it could be a mixed group, but they are trustworthy people who know you and you know them, and you know when they're up against a challenge, and you know when they are not in good health, and you know that you can support them spiritually, and also that just watching it moving from chatter to sacred circle. I mean, that's one of the things. Once you've been in a circle in which it is a sacred circle or a spiritual circle, and it would at the end have some final spiritual energy brought in, the chatter of just getting together at the beginning stops. You see what time it is, you go into the meeting, and then you take turns speaking up. You don't jump in and analyze each other. You speak up and you are telling people what's going on with you, and they care. And if they happen to have a particular idea or something, they may bring it up later. Or then.
Obrigada. Eu agradeço.
I really would encourage, I would really encourage everyone to consider being in a circle of others that you would meet maybe once every other week, maybe for an hour, hour and a half, maybe online, maybe in person, and that you might start out just by talking about yourselves so you know each other, and speak to wanting support for whatever is important for them at that point. I hope some of you form circles, because especially as you grow older and the more energy you have to do with your life, you have reason to keep on growing older. And what I found out is that I lost good friends in their 60s and early 70s. And it often had something to do with whether there's some reason to keep on having the energy to keep on doing whatever you're doing. So it helps when you have a calling, when you know that what you are doing does matter and that you're involved in it. Then you have to stay healthy enough to keep on doing it for a bit longer. And often older women in the traditional style is you're supposed to be a caretaker for other people, or you're just supposed to be a nice old lady. Well, you can define yourself as you have defined yourself at every stage when you get to be an equivocally like I am. I'm an old lady, but it doesn't fit me at all. I don't think of myself as an old lady. I'd add a few adjectives to that, and then it would work. But as long as you have the energy to do something that's of value to you, either creative or objective or caretaking in some way in which you want to do what you're doing, I tell you, it does keep you taking care of your health and your friendships and and the family connections. Maybe just your curiosity will keep you going too. So what is this planet going to do with itself? I don't know. Well, it has been a pleasure. Shall we end it with the sound of the Tibetan bowl? And I will hit the...
Peraí. Eu queria fazer uma última pergunta. Posso? Antes de você tocar o sino? Fiquei pensando o seguinte, queria te fazer a seguinte questão. Com toda a sua experiência, com toda a sua bagagem de vida, com todos os livros que você já escreveu, do alto dos seus quase 80 anos, a minha pergunta é o seguinte: no final, vai dar tudo certo?
Okay. Oh, well, I do have a sense that there is an ongoing... one of the things I've done is I wrote what I thought was my memoir. I thought I was finished with it when the pandemic broke out. And I had actually sent it to my publisher, and it had been there for just a couple of weeks when I pulled it back. with a sense of, I am not done yet. So I'm not done yet. I'm not ready to, because a memoir sort of feels like it ends where you're ready to sort of be overdoing whatever you've been doing. But clearly this pandemic has brought alive so much that I have been doing. And so I hope to be able to get into writing the last phase of the moons, because I'm a Cancerian astrologically, and my life and the lifetimes of people fit the phases of the moon. You come in and you're a sliver and you grow into a quarter, and then you get to be full, and then you begin to become waning. And except that the dark of the moon at the very end is the fourth phase of the moon. And I am convinced that there is after you leave the body, there is another phase. I've had enough connections from people who talk to people or seen people who have died. And so I don't have a fear of dying. I just want to I clearly just want to get done what I want to get done before I leave, unless I'm supposed to leave earlier or something. But there is something about when you have a life that you have a lot yet to do. I think it does extend your life, and it helps the various health reasons that come up, and you get it treated, and you rally because you want to.
Então eu estou achando que a resposta é: vai dar tudo certo. Obrigado, Jean. Foi prazer te receber.
Thank you all. It's been fun.
Foi prazer te receber. Uma satisfação
imensa. I did want to hit this one more time. And in the silence that each of you have, will something come up for you to hold in your heart and your mind about you and about your life and about your talent and about what you might want to do with it? My heart to yours.
Thank you, John. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Bye.
It's nice to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boa noite a todos. Boa noite, Marcos. Obrigada. Prazer conhecer vocês também, viu?
A gente agradece de novo a presença de todos no Teaços. Encontro para lá de especial, para lá de emotivo, presença rica, afetuosa da Jean. Espero que a gente possa nos revermos todos em breve. Jean, muito obrigado. Um grande abraço.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Somewhere.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Obrigada. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Obrigada.